Alright, this tweet got absolutely piled on, and I don't want to add to it, so I'm gonna hide this Twitter user's name and just try to be nice, and please don't go respond to this tweet, enough people have. But it does highlight something I've been thinking about lately. It says, some of y'all want activism and protesting to be so effing boring. When you're this anti-fun, don't be surprised if people don't want to organize with you. Now, I like to think I'm a fun person. Most people who knew me in college would say I like to have fun. However, there are a lot of things that aren't fun that are still worth doing. And organizing is one of those things. You can have fun while you're doing it as a byproduct of doing it, but the focus is always on organizing. The focus should never be on making sure everyone has fun. To be honest with you, door knocking and talking to random people about socialism really isn't that fun, but it is worth it. And this is how it relates to what I've been thinking about lately. This is a phenomenon that you would only ever see in the West. And it shows that American leftists have no concept of what the struggle is even like outside of the Western world. I've been talking to a friend who spent a year in Afghanistan lately and thinking about their conditions compared to ours and what it would be like to organize for socialism in that situation. The reason the Soviets went into Afghanistan is because they had to help the Marxist democratic government that wanted to come to power fight off extremist groups like the Mujahideen who had been fighting for power in the area for a long time and were now being funded and armed by the United States. The Marxist democratic government and the Soviets would be defeated, and the Mujahideen would later splinter into Al-Qaeda and other groups who now had guns because the US had flooded the region with guns. The US invaded in 2001, and by the time they left last year, the Taliban were fighting ISIS for power. So now imagine being a communist in Afghanistan and going out to do some political organizing. If you have somebody in your party who's saying that your organizing isn't fun enough, you probably need to expel them from the party because they might get you killed. Like, Western leftists just cannot imagine these conditions. It's impossible for us. They're too different from ours. In countries destabilized by imperialism, there are violent anti-communist groups who are armed to the teeth. Communists and socialists have to arm themselves, defend themselves, train themselves mentally and physically, or they might be killed, and there's nothing fun about that. But they're trying to create a better life for their people and develop their countries economically. So even though it's not fun, it's still worth doing. And also, if a Marxist party took power in Afghanistan tomorrow, some certain things would need to be done that would make Western leftists very uncomfortable. You know, you have to do something about the extremists that have been armed and emboldened by the US for years. And how quickly would Western leftists dismiss them as violent and evil and not real socialists without really understanding their conditions or history at all? Eddie thinks imperialism's alright as long as the USSR does it. Yeah, for sure. Did you know that during the Cold War there was a leaked CIA document where the CIA stated that one of their strategies was to accuse the USSR of imperialism and conflate it with American imperialism? For example, acting like the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which was at the request of a Marxist democratic government which was being set up there at the time, is the same thing as the US funneling a bunch of arms and weapons into the Mujahideen, which was Osama bin Laden's group in Afghanistan, and then invading the country years later to fight terrorism. These are the same thing, right? They're both just imperialism, according to the CIA and people in my comments. One of their strategies was to accuse the USSR of imperialism and conflate it with American imperialism. For example, acting like the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which was at the request of a Marxist democratic government, which was being set up there at
This would be like saying the US invasion of South Vietnam wasn't imperialism because the South Vietnamese government technically requested it. Now, the US backed a coup against their leader once he became inconvenient for us, but both before and after the coup, it was absolutely imperialism. The black dots represent places the US bombed. The South Vietnamese government wasn't elected, it didn't have popular support, and it was being propped up by imperial powers. Now let's look at the Soviets in Afghanistan. In 1978, there's a revolution and the communists come to power. Taraki becomes the new leader. He's then taken out in a coup backed by Brezhnev and the Soviets. Hafizullah Amin becomes the leader. Despite the revolution, the communists don't really have popular support, and so Amin requests Soviet troops to help maintain his government. The Soviets do invade. They also take out Amin and install their own leader, and proceed to wage a devastating war that kills over 1 million Afghans. You can literally see the population drop from when the war started. Now, simultaneously, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan waged their own imperialist war. funneling billions in weapons and support to some of the most extremist factions of the Mujahideen fighters. All of that to say, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was of course an act of imperialism. To this day, Afghans are being brutalized by imperialist practices. Sure, the US withdrew troops, but they also froze their central bank's assets along with several other Western nations, and now millions of Afghans are on the brink of starvation.
Thank you for your video. I have some problems with it though. So the US, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia weren't funding extremists simultaneously to the Soviet invasion. They were doing it 10 years prior, as Vijay Prashad points out in this video. And the Communist Revolution was the culmination of a long history of progressive social reform that had been taking place in Afghanistan. And the Western powers supported a lot of extremists and fundamentalists opposed to this, who did things like acid attack women who were studying at university. The extremists were given refuge and shelter in Pakistan, where they created great unrest on the border. And when Afghanistan launched literacy programs prior to the Communist Revolution to try and increase the literacy rate, which at that time was 17%, the extremists started coming over the border and killing the literacy workers. So this is why the Afghan government asked the Soviets to come in 10 times before the Soviets actually did. And you're choosing to compare the government that the US helped set up in South Vietnam to the government that the Soviets helped set up in Afghanistan. And you yourself show this map of black dots that represent the places the US bombed in Vietnam in order to create the conditions for setting up a US puppet government. So why did the Soviets not have to do anything like this before they were asked to enter Afghanistan? And South Vietnam's government collapsed much quicker than the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan because the Communist Revolution in Afghanistan grew from the forces within Afghanistan. Like I said earlier, it was the culmination of various social reform movements that had been developing in Afghanistan for years. So it had much more support from the people than the puppet government of South Vietnam. And as Vijay said, acting like it doesn't kind of takes onus away from the Afghan people, who yes, have been affected by British imperialism and American imperialism and the Soviet intervention, but they're still their own people with their own identity who have created their own history. And the US chose to back the most extremist forces internal to Afghanistan before invading and occupying the country to fight terrorism. And we both agree that's bad, but you just can't equate it to the Soviets like the CIA said they're going to try and do in a leaked document. Because of course the Soviets made mistakes, but even the most imperialist propaganda outlets admit that they did a lot of good in Afghanistan. Because they came at the behest of the Marxists, Democrats, and social reformers. So they built a lot of infrastructure and hospitals, some that are still standing and in use today. I mean, that's just not even in the same ballpark as what the US has done. You can't just look at this and say, these are both imperialism. Especially when the CIA is saying that that's one of their tactics. And for a response to this video's claims about the Soviet Union doing a coup or some of the leaders they backed, check out this video from Redguard9 and make some really good points using the same source material that's used in the video we're responding to. And thanks to this guy, Carl, for not calling me a Putin bot.
So there's a lot about this video I disagree with. I recommend you go watch it and then watch this video again. I would recommend everyone, including Carl, to not use Wikipedia when learning about topics associated with socialism, because there's a tendency for them to be extremely biased or just to outright lie about these topics. Firstly, Carl, you claim that Taraki is taken out in a coup backed by the Soviets. There's honestly just no proof for this, and all the proof we have points towards the opposites. They elect Taraki. Soviets actually advised Taraki to get rid of Amin from power entirely. And if you read the source you're citing as well, just a few lines below it, it says, Taraki's murder shocked and upset Brezhnev. The claim that Brezhnev ordered Taraki's killing comes from this. Listen, according to Amin's nephew Merway, Amin sent a message to Brezhnev saying, Taraki's still around, what should I do with him? If you wish, I can send him to Moscow. Brezhnev's answer was received. Quote, there's no need to send Taraki to Moscow. This is your problem. You must solve it in a manner you consider best. So, firstly, as this says, it's according to Amin's nephew. This is not a primary source. Secondly, this just kind of implies that Brezhnev was not messing with their government. They made their own decisions. Even though he wasn't actually a head of Amin, they liked Taraki, as I already said. Your entire argument that the Soviets committed imperialism was based on this argument in the first place. Also, previously, the Afghanistan government had asked numerous times for the Soviets to send military assistance, and they had denied them until this point. But the Soviets did not like Amin being in power because they had a serious concern that Amin was actually a CIA asset, partly because of the time he actually lived in the US. Amin's coup destabilized the government, and he began purging Taraki supporters. So if the Soviets honestly believed that Amin was a CIA asset, then this seems very genuine. The Tsar government was organic, it wasn't reliant on the Soviets, unlike South Vietnam. In fact, after the Soviets pulled out, the government lasted for 3 years, 1 year longer than the Soviet Union lasted. Now, compare that with South Vietnam, which was not an organic government. It didn't last 1 minute after the Americans left. They were literally chased out. They were shot out as they were leaving. They also said the Tsar government was unpopular, and I would ask, who was it unpopular to? Every time there's a massive political change, maybe a new state for example, a reaction develops to that new state, such as 1917. Now the reaction or the opposition to the Tsar government was feudal landlords, tribesmen, fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists, mullahs. These people were all vehemently opposed to the new government because it was incredibly progressive in many ways.
Communists come